Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Jim Baltzer, the manager of the Department of Labor and Regulation office here in Madison, and I'd like to welcome everybody to coming today. Special thanks to our friends at East River for providing a great venue for us to hold a seminar like this, and also for providing our refreshments today. Some housekeeping business. As far as restrooms go, I'm told that each door will lead you to a restroom, so I hope you find it if you need it. We're really excited to have Tom Hart here today, the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Labor and Regulation. I think he's got a pretty full agenda of items he wants to cover, starting with an overview of the Department of Labor. But before we get started, I wanted to take just a couple minutes. We did a mailing in the last week or so about this event, and we also sent some information about some soft skills training that the Department of Labor brought to the state about a year ago. Our department secretary and the governor had been hearing that from a lot of employers that people are just really lacking in those soft skills on the job. So the Department of Labor pursued the Bring Your A Game curriculum and brought it to the state, and has trained several different providers across the state, and they are providing this statewide. What's changed since about a year ago is the demand was not too great as far as we weren't getting a lot of people asking for the class. And in order to assist employers with workforce development issues, the Department of Labor has decided that they will fund and pay for any business that wants to send an employee to the Bring Your A Game class. There's Kathy Haugen is with Outsource Projects out of Brookings, and she's the provider for the Madison area. So she does offer this class at the Department of Labor office periodically when we have enough people signed up to take it. But this is the type of program that could be customized and brought to a business if a business was interested in, whatever it was, maybe having new probationary employees go through it or something like that. So what I wanted to do is just, before we start with Tom's presentation, give Kathy just a couple minutes to, say a few words about Bring Your A Game. And I didn't have a sign-in sheet, but I mentioned to Lois, I think she started one going around. In case her or Tom they have anything that needs to get sent out, we have a sign-in sheet where we can get your email address and your names and everything. So with that, I'll let Kathy say a few words.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. As Jim said, my name is Kathy Haugen. I've been working in career and technical education for about 25 years, so this fits really well with career and technical ed. And you had said some of the things that I was going to say, that the Bring Your A Game workshop is now being offered for free through the South Dakota Department of Labor and Regulation. Bring Your A Game to work, and I've talked to some of you multiple times because I've come to these meetings before. But the 7 workplace behaviors or soft skills that Bring Your A Game works on is attitude, attendance, appearance, ambition, accountability, acceptance, and appreciation. The curriculum is very versatile, so if you have 30 people in a class, there are large group activities. If you have 8 people in a class, there's small group activities, low energy, high energy. It's very versatile, and we go with the flow throughout the day and choose which activities we'll do with the participants. If we go out to your business, we'd like to have a minimum of 8 students and up to 30 students. Like Jim said, we are offering a class next week at the Madison Department of Labor. It'll be from 9 to 3:30. And they want you to sign up online, which through the DLR.SD.gov. Good. We can customize it for you. You can offer a 2-hour, 4-hour, 6-hour, or 8-hour class, so you could do 2 4-hour sessions. One thing I caution about a 2-hour class, it seems that just when you're really getting the class to come together and feel comfortable with one another, it ends. So I recommend either the 2 4-hour classes or the 6 or 8-hour class. So I'm going to leave my card with Jim, and you can contact me directly. My phone number's on there and my email address. But before I go, is there any questions for me? Okay. Thank you for the time this morning. I appreciate it.
Could everyone hear me? All right. I appreciate everyone coming today, and I know you're thinking to yourself, 2 hours of employment laws. Oh, my goodness. The first slide is kind of the agenda, but it's a guideline. I want this to be interactive. If you ever have questions, please feel free to ask them. This presentation, if we don't get through the whole presentation, it's 70 slides long. I will provide it to Jim, and he can get all the slide deck to you. Usually I give about a 2-hour presentation on each of these subjects. So I'm going to be buzzing through some stuff pretty fast, but please stop me at any time. I like to walk around. I came into from Pier this morning. It was a beautiful drive. For anyone hunting Saturday on Highway 34 area, I saw multiple pheasants, so it should be a good Saturday. So this is kind of our discussion, but before I begin, I just wanted to kind of expand on what the Department of Labor and Regulation is. We're a pretty large agency. We have over 400 employees throughout the state. A lot of you probably know Department of Labor and Regulation through Jim Baltzer and his crew and staff that are here today. We have 12 job service offices throughout the state: Sioux Falls, Rapid City, the ESD communities, any community that has a Regent institution. And then we have some other smaller offices that provide limited services, and then we do itinerant services throughout the state. And those offices provide primarily our Title I, II, and III workforce training and education. Our Title I helps adults, dislocated workers, youth that are in school or out of school. We also provide through Title II our adult education and literacy, English as a second language, things of that nature. And then Title III is our employment services. We not just help job seekers. There's a lot of tools in the quiver that the local offices, our job service offices have to also help businesses. One of the greatest tools that we have is our SD work system. Some of the staff might not think it's this great thing of comprehensive, but it's for the user and for businesses. It's a wonderful system to help post your jobs, do matching, screen applicants, things of that nature. Another division that we have is our Labor Market Information Center, and that's really helpful for both applicants, but really for businesses. We work with the Bureau of Labor Statistics to provide labor market information, and we can drill it down on the center, the virtual center. You can drill down by community. You can drill down by county. What are the hot jobs? What's the average weekly wage? What's an hourly wage? What type of skill sets are people looking for in certain occupations? So it can give you as a business kind of idea of what the labor market is in your community, county, or trade area. Some other services that we provide, as Kathy and Jim had stated, is Bring Your A Game. It is free. It has been, since we started offering it free to businesses, we've gotten a lot of positive feedback from the businesses. I mean, these are non-negotiable skills that we all have. And for some reason, some of these skills, accountability, attendance, appearance, ambition, are just not there. And whether it's a seasoned workforce or our younger youth starting in the workforce. And one of the reasons why that's happening is, we have a workforce shortage in South Dakota. And nationally and in South Dakota, one of the untapped areas where the workforce, there's supply is the youth. And that's 18 and younger. I mean, I can probably ask all of you, in this room, when's the first time you had your job? And I'm guessing about 100% would say before they were, out of high school, right? Well, youth these days, and there's various factors, aren't going to work until after maybe they go to a tech school, or they go to the military, or they go to a 4-year institution. So there's a lot of skill sets that they're not learning, the soft skills, until after they're out of school or getting training. And so we want to help those youth get those skill sets, help the businesses train their staff on those skill sets. South Dakota still does a great job. We are at 52% of our youth are in the workforce. Nationally, it's about 43%, so we're ahead of the national average. But 10 years ago, we were at 62%. And so it's a downward trend of our youth getting in the workforce. Some of the other services we offer to businesses, we do WOTC, the Work Opportunity Tax Credit. We have the CSEP program, which is the Senior Community Employment Services for individuals over 55, and some other determinations. We do foreign labor certification, so that's H-2A, H-2Bs. We do TAA, which is when a company has a mass layoff and they're moving to another country to help get those displaced workers back in the workforce. So that's our workforce side. We also have unemployment insurance. We have all the fun stuff, right, as a business, unemployment insurance. So unemployment insurance is up in Aberdeen. That was a federal program. We'll talk about it later on. It's now administered by all the states, have their own program. We have about 70 staff in Aberdeen for unemployment insurance. We also have the Division of Labor and Management, which a lot of the areas where Division of Labor and Management come in are things we're going to talk about today. And that's wage and hour, employment laws, work comp. We have the work comp ALJs, which are the administrative law judges. We do union negotiations for public employers. So if there's a union and the employer is like a county, a municipality, a school district, DSU, which is a regent institution, if the union and the employer cannot come to an agreement, they go to impasse. We would then hold the conciliation. If the conciliation doesn't work, then it can go to fact-finding. We do that. We also do grievances. So if there's an unfair labor practice or a grievance, we oversee that. We do human rights. We do a partnership with the EEOC out of the Chicago office for human rights. Sure I'm missing something. Oh, so the regulation side. We touch your lives every day, whether you know it. We oversee the Division of Banking. So they regulate the state chartered banks, any trust companies that are sited here in South Dakota. We oversee the Division of Insurance. So whether that's property, casualty, health, life insurance. We do all the licensing for agent, broker, producers. For the entities, we ensure that the insurance companies are, we try to protect the public for insurance companies doing nefarious activities. We also oversee the Division of Securities, which is your investment advisor, reps, private placements, things of that nature. And then we have 9 boards and commissions, and that ranges from electricians, plumbers, barbers, cosmetologists, abstractors, board of technical professions, and so on. And so the department is pretty varied, but we're going to kind of focus on today are these things. And again, this is a guideline. Stop me at any time if you have questions. I like this to be more interactive. 2 hours of listening to me talk, I would poke my eyes out myself. So let's kind of go over the major provisions. The first thing we're going to talk about is what's called the FLSA. That's the Fair Labor Standard Act. That's actually a federal regulation. We don't oversee it, but it comes into play a lot for a lot of our determinations. And so employers in South Dakota have to follow 2 sets of rules when it comes to employment laws. They have to follow, obviously, South Dakota employment laws. If you're an employer in South Dakota, you have to follow South Dakota employment laws. And then the vast majority of employers also have to follow the federal regulations, which we don't enforce. The enforcement is out of Sioux Falls and Rapid. And so the question is, how do I know which one to follow? Because there's times when there's a conflict between our state law says one thing and the federal law says the other, which one applies. And so when you have a conflict, you apply the one that is least restrictive to the employee. And I'll give you some examples of that. And so for the FLSA to apply is that there must be an employment relationship between the employer and the employee. And the point of that is I hire Jim to paint my house. That's not an employee-employer relationship. Jim is an independent contractor to paint my house. But if I have a painting business and I hire Jim and I exceed dominion and control, I direct what hours he works, where he works, then that relationship is an employer-employee relationship. You hire someone to mow your yard. That's not an employer-employee relationship. So none of these laws would apply to you. So the question is, which one do you follow? So all employers have to follow South Dakota law. Employers that have 2 or more employees and $500,000 in annual sales or revenue, every employee in that entity is covered, and you have to follow the FLSA. That's called enterprise coverage. Then the second thing you look at is, I'm a mom and pop restaurant in Madison, South Dakota. I have 2 or more employees, but I only do $300,000 in sales. Then you look at what that specific employee does. And if that employee deals in interstate commerce, then that specific employee, based upon the roles and responsibilities within your business, is covered by the FLSA. What does interstate commerce mean? It can be as simple as you have a cashier and you accept credit cards to run a transaction and they swipe the card. That's interstate commerce. You have someone that does ordering for you for supplies over the phone. That can be interstate commerce. So the safer side of caution is if you think some of your employees are covered, and because you're under that $500,000 threshold and you think some of your employees are covered, it's just better to follow the FLSA as a whole because you don't want to get triggered, because the penalties for that, again, we don't enforce them. Sioux Falls and Rapid federal offices enforce them. The penalties are much harsher than just following the FLSA. So as you can see, over 135 million workers, more than 7 million workplaces are protected or covered by the FLSA. A scenario where it might not be a FLSA covered is you're a small construction company or a roofing company or a drive-in and you don't accept credit cards and your staff doesn't do any of the ordering. They're just serving employees or serving customers. That's probably the limited scope of when an entity is not covered by the FLSA. And so as I stated, there's 2 types of coverages. There's the enterprise coverage as a whole. That's 2 or more employees and $500,000 in revenue. And then individual coverage where you look at the specific activities of that individual employee. There's certain businesses, whether it's nonprofits or governmental, that no matter what type of revenue they do, hospitals, for instance, are always covered by the FLSA. Again, this is individual coverage. It's kind of further explains what that is. But as you can see, it's very easy to get covered by the individual coverage. Making out-of-state phone calls, receiving, sending interstate mail or electronic communications, credit card transactions, accepting supplies. And so as a business owner, it's best, if any of those activities occur in your business, to just cover everyone by the FLSA. And again, small construction companies, small independently owned retail or service businesses are typically only businesses that aren't covered by the federal law. So minimum wage. This is an instance where you have FLSA says one thing, state law says the other. Which one applies? So the federal minimum wage is $7.25. The state minimum wage right now is $8.85, And that goes up to, by the way, January 1 of this year, goes up to $9.10. We made the announcement back in early October. And that was because of initiated measure 18 back in 2014. Our minimum wage is indexed to inflation every year. It's a state statute. And I just always want everyone to know, we don't just pluck out of the air what that minimum wage is. It's not us making that determination. There's a state statute voted on by the people. We're supposed to follow it. And so right now, the state minimum wage is $8.85. As a business, what do you follow? State or federal? Well, you got to follow the state because that's better for the employee. So every business in South Dakota follows the state minimum wage when it comes to whether FLSA or the state law applies. And compensation can include multiple things. It can include the wages, commissions, certain bonuses. The other difference between federal and state law is, I don't know if there's any businesses here that do tip credits for their employees. Do any of your employees, are they like servers or bartenders or anything of that nature? Well, there's a tip credit. It's in both FLSA and the state law. For state law, and this is the one you have to follow, everyone has to follow because it's better for the employee. An employer can take a tip credit for 50% of the state minimum wage. Minimum wage right now is $8.85. So a business where an employee receives tips, and that's defined as anyone that gets more than $30 or a month in tips, the employer can actually pay them 50%, which is $4.42.50, and then take a tip credit for the difference for the minimum wage. Now, the employer is required to document those tips earned by that employee, because if there's a shortage, so if I worked a 10-hour shift, I was paid $4.43.50 or $4.43, and I only made $2 in tips during that 10-hour shift, the employer has to make up that difference of the minimum wage. And it's not hard to document it anymore. I mean, I think even though people still use cash quite a bit, point of purchase systems, everything's swiped. Those credits or the tips and everything get allocated within the system. And so the documentation for the employer is quite easy. The other thing that can be included in compensation is like room and board. So we see this a lot. We get wage complaints, someone calling in saying, well, I worked at this hunting lodge or a fishing lodge for last month, and they only paid me $7.50 an hour. Isn't minimum wage $8.85? We say, you're correct. And then we go in and look at it, and they were also given a free room, and they were given all meals. The employer can quantify that room, and it's based upon like the monthly rent or the nightly rent for that area. And then they can also take the amount, the cost of the food to the employer to include in their wage to make that whatever they gave in cash wages go above minimum wage. Some fast food restaurants do that quite a bit. They might pay a kid or someone $8 an hour, but they get a free cheeseburger during their shift. And then they take that credit of that cheeseburger and add it to the $8, and it takes them over minimum wage. The thing with it, though, is that the employer can only credit the cost of that food, not the menu price. And so if the cost of the burger was $1 and the menu price is $4, they can't say, well, we gave you a $4 burger. They can only do the cost. The other wage that a lot of people don't know about, some people use it. I don't know how they find kids that would agree to this. But in South Dakota and in the feds, there's a thing called the opportunity wage. And so an employer can pay someone that's under the age of 20. So not 20 and under, but up to the age of 20. The first 90 days of their employment, they can pay them $4.25. And that 90 days starts on the first day they work, and the clock runs for 90 calendar days or until they reach the age of 20. And it's not 90 days of work. So if I worked on Monday and I didn't work till the next Monday is not my second day, that would be my 8th day. And the employer can only use that once per child or per youth. So they can't do it one summer and then have them come the next summer back. Some employers use it. I guess I don't know. I think youth, getting them engaged in the workforce is tough enough, and then to tell them they're going to pay them 4 1/4 is probably even more difficult. But it is out there. It's an option. These are the rules on the lodging in regards to getting the credit towards that. And the reason I have this slide is we get this, believe it or not, we get this question as a wage complaint. Because that was one of the things that Jim wanted to go over was some of our typical wage complaints. In wage and hour, it's kind of like the Pareto theory. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the Pareto theory. It's 80% of your issues come from 20% of the population or situations. We have hundreds and hundreds of wage and hour type statutes, whether it's FLSA or state law. And about 80% of our wage complaints come from about 3 different areas, and this is one of them, where people are doing transitional work or seasonal work for a hunting lodge, a fishing establishment. They're a manager at a hotel, like the Dewdrop Inn in Miller, South Dakota, and they're managing it on site, living in a lodging. They complain that they're not getting paid the right wage. Well, when you put the lodging and everything into it, they actually are making minimum wage. The other thing we get a lot on is we can only enforce the minimum wage. And so if we have an employee call us up and say, well, I agreed to be paid $15 an hour. Last week I worked 40 hours, and they didn't pay me $600. They paid me $350. We can't do anything about that because all we can do is enforce the state minimum wage. And if they made, $350 divided by 40 is, I guess, not quite to minimum wage. We would say they owe you a quarter. But anything outside of minimum wage, that's a contract issue. That'd be a breach of contract. The employee would have to file whether a small claims court action, if it's under $8,000, or a civil court action against the employer to get that difference between state minimum wage and whatever contractual or wage that they had agreed to. This is another area where we get a lot of wage complaints, deductions. We get questions from employees all the time on what they can deduct. Certain deductions are fine, and you can do pretty much, like if they don't return their shirt, or you're deducting them for, a jean or a uniform. Couldn't think of that word for a while. Tools, things of that nature. You can deduct the value of that from their paycheck, but you only can deduct down to minimum wage. And so where this comes in is you have an employee that worked, they quit their job and they didn't return their tools, and the tools are worth $300, and the employer deducts the wages down to $100 for a 40-hour work week. We tell the employer, you can deduct the value of those tools. That's legal. But you cannot deduct below minimum wage. And if you want to get that difference, you have to then file a small claims or circuit court, or report it to the authorities. And then if it's reported to the authorities and it's considered a crime, then you can deduct it below minimum wage. But a lot of employers don't want to start a criminal action on that. The type of deductions that you can drive an employee down below minimum wage, though, are any type of deductions that are primarily for the benefit of the employee. Instances of that are some businesses might have supplemental insurance, like Aflac comes in to sign up some of your employees on some supplemental insurance plans, and the employee agrees to have that deducted from their weekly paycheck or monthly paycheck. If that takes them below minimum wage, that's fine, because that's something the employee agreed to and it's to their benefit. It's not primarily a benefit to the employer. And so we get a lot of questions on that. Another area where this comes into play is certain businesses, like a convenience store or a grocery store, might allow employees to run a tab where they take product, they write it down, and then the employer deducts it from their weekly paycheck. That's fine to do. The thing is, as an employer, make sure you do that. Don't let them run up a 6-month tab, because after 30 days, then it becomes you can't deduct it below minimum wage. And so we get that once in a while. Employer will call up and says, yeah, they ran a tab. And we'll be like, well, how often did you deduct? Well, it was kind of once in a while we deduct, sometimes we wouldn't. Well, when was the product accepted by the employee for this tab? And they say, oh, was it like 9 months ago? You can't then deduct below minimum wage. It has to be within 30 days of when the employee got the product. I went the wrong way here. All right, so this is just a quick exercise that sometimes we get. So state minimum wage is $8.85. The hourly rate is $9. They work 30 hours, and then there's employer-required uniform costs that the employer charges. Hy-Vee does this. Certain employers do this. Might charge the employee for the uniform. $270 is what they should have earned at $9 an hour, less than $30 for the uniform, so they're paid $240. The problem with that is state minimum wage is $8.85 times 30 hours, so they had to pay them at least $265.50 for. So in this paycheck, they should have only deducted $4.50. And so it's important as employers to do that. If they're going to be deducting, to continue to do it. Some employers just try to do it all in one fell swoop. The tipped employee, we talked briefly on that. I won't go over it anymore since it doesn't sound like any employers have tipped employees in here. This is, again, tip credit. So another question that we get a lot is the hours worked, and that's the whole permitted or suffered to work. FLSA and state law require employees be paid for all the time considered to be hours worked. And this may, doesn't say shall, this may include time spent being what's called engaged to wait. And a typical scenario of that is the secretary is waiting to get to do some transcribing for their boss, and they're sitting at their desk, not really doing work. I mean, they're at work, but they're not doing work, but they're engaged to wait. They can't just get up and leave their desk and go home and let the dog out. That would be considered hours worked. Where engaged to wait is what's called waiting to be engaged, is a scenario where the employee has the ability to leave the premises, go mow the yard, go run to the grocery store. They're not in the dominion and control. They can use their time as they want. Now, that's not compensable. That's not required to be paid. The other issue is on-call. If someone's on call but they're required to be on the premises, that's considered hours worked. But if they're on call and all they have to do is provide a phone number where they can be reached, or they have a cell phone or a pager or whatnot, and they can go home or do whatever they want, that's not considered hours worked. Now the employer, I'm guessing though, will probably pay a couple dollar on-call duty pay, but you don't have to pay minimum wage for those on-call hours where the employee has the right to go home. Training, another one of those 80% of our questions come from 20% of the issues. Training is one of the misunderstood, along with commuting, areas of state wage and hour laws. Essentially about 95% of all training has to be paid. It's considered hours worked, and I have a slide on that. We'll go over that. Traveling to and from work, and there's multiple different scenarios. Jim decides to live in Brookings and works in Madison. His commute time from Brookings to Madison, that's not hours worked, because Jim made the choice to live in Brookings. He's got his choice to live wherever. But let's say I called Jim up and said, Jim, I need you in Pierre this afternoon, and Jim drives from his house in Brookings to Pierre, If his normal shift is 9 to 5, any hours where he's driving, that's hours worked. And any hours where he's driving from his home to pier, which is not his normal duty station, can be considered hours worked. However, as an employer, you can also deduct the time of his normal commute back from that. So if it takes him normally a half hour to get to work, and you have him going to a one-day stay and back the same day, you can pay for that travel time outside of the normal work hours, but you can deduct their normal commute time. And then there's different rules that come into play when there's an overnight stay. And sleep time is the last area. If it's under 24 hours, the shift is under 24 hours, sleep time is considered hours worked. If it's over 24 hours, the employee and the employer can agree to up to an 8-hour period where sleep time is not considered hours worked. And then work not requested, and we've all had this. I just had a staff person the other day. Lunch is noon to 1, and you walk by their their desk or their office, and it's 12:10, and they're sitting at their desk. And you see them working, and then they take their lunch hour, and they come back, but they come back at 1, and at the end of the day, they only put in 8 hours. Even if you have a policy that says no working during lunch hour, only work 8 to 5, if they don't get approval from that and they're doing it, that's considered hours work and it has to be compensable. So it's very important if you have policies. If you let your employees do that, the risk that you're running is that employee, when they're employed with you, it's a marriage, right? Everyone's happy for the most part. But then when there's a separation, whether by voluntary or by termination, it's like a divorce, and things can get nasty. And so they can go up to 2 years to prove for back wages. And that doesn't just trigger hours worked, but it could also trigger overtime issues where you have to pay overtime pay if they had some of those hours worked. Overtime, by the way, just so you guys know, overtime is not in state law. We don't require it. So if I get a claimant calls up and says, I worked 50 hours last week and my rate was $10 an hour and they only paid me $500, I said, that's fine. We don't do time and a half in South Dakota, but the FLSA does require time and a half. So this is kind of more of a detailed slide on waiting time, and this is the engaged to wait. So if the employee is unable to use waiting time effectively for their own purposes, and that waiting time is controlled by the employer, that's hours worked. If the employee is completely relieved from duty, and the break time is long enough for employee to use for their own purposes, that's not hours worked. Where that comes into play, and you guys probably get this from employees once in a while, is, well, it's state law to give me a 15-minute break in the morning and a 15-minute break in the afternoon, and you're required to give me an hour lunch break. And that's not true. That's not true by state law nor by the FLSA. The feds don't require any type of break time unless it's certain types of occupations, CDL, over-the-road truckers, pilots. There's some requirements for firemen, EMTs, and so forth. But for your basic employee, the feds nor us require any statutory break or lunch period. The next question then comes, let's say as an employer, if I do provide those, which ones do I have to count as hours worked and which ones aren't hours worked? Both under the Fed and state law, because we follow the feds on this, is essentially if the break is 20 minutes or less, you compensate that. So if you have everyone gets at 10 o'clock, you can take a 15-minute break, and they can do whatever they want. It's not like you can take a 15-minute break, but you're sitting at your desk just sitting there. You can take a 15-minute break to go run some errands. You can take a 2 o'clock break to go run some errands. If it's under 20 minutes, actually, it's not compensable. A lot of employers, they'll pick 15 minutes, so it doesn't go into over that 15. It's a little legway for them. And then if it's over 20 minutes, that's generally not considered compensable. So if you have a 30-minute lunch break for your employees, you don't have to pay that. So like the state, for instance, we're 8 to 5 for our hourly employees with a noon to 1 or a 1 to 2 lunch break, and so they work an 8-hour day. They don't get compensated for that hour that they get off. On-call time, again, whether it's hours worked or not hours worked when the employee is on call but has to stay on the premises. They're under the dominion or control of the employee, or they must be so close that they can't effectively use their time for their own purposes. So it's like, yeah, you don't have to be at your desk, but you have to be on the campus. You know, that's hours worked under the FLSA. Not hours worked, you know, is obviously kind of the vice of that, or the opposite of that. I just provide my contact information. I can go home and do a break. Sometimes we get questions in regards to, well, when I'm on call for EMT or a firefighter, is that hours work because I have to be within the community or 20 miles or something of the community, and I can't drink a beer if I'm on the lake. FLSA and state law, that's not considered dominion or control. Just because you can't drink doesn't mean that you're under the control of the employer when you're on call, nor does having to stay within like the community, because you can still go home. I mean, yeah, you can't go to Sioux Falls if you're on call, but you can still go home and do your normal things that you do on a daily basis. Again, this is rest and meal periods, kind of the slide describing that. Training time. We get this question again. It's another one of those. Training time. For instance, Hy-Vee does this a lot. You know, they do like an employee orientation or an onboarding day. A lot of employers do that. And it's maybe like the day before they technically start their first shift. If the employer requires it, and it's outside of regular work hours, it's related to the job, and the employee does any type of productive work, that must be compensated. So these are the situations, all 4 of these have to be met for it not to be compensated. And it's pretty tough. I mean, you know, I guess, you know, for the state, we have some things where we might have some employee training. You know, it's like, this is voluntary, you don't have to do it. It's at 7 o'clock at night. It's not job related, so let's say it's dealing with health, you know, understanding the health system or healthcare insurance that we provide, and they're just there to listen, then that's not hours worked and doesn't need to be compensable. But we get quite a few of these on training, and when the employer is notified that and understands it, they'll pay it. A lot of it is just a misunderstanding. Travel time, as I stated, ordinary home to work travel is not compensable work time. If that is traveling to their normal home base. Now, if you have, and I'll get to this later, travel between job sites. This happens in the construction industry. It might happen with East River. I suppose going to different spots. When it's traveling between the job sites during a normal work day, that is compensable, that is considered work time. And that's during their normal work day. So let's say I'm an at-home nurse, and I go to client 1 at 9 o'clock, and then I have to go to client 2 at 2 o'clock, and I have to drive 120 miles. That's my normal work shift. That time is compensable. There's special rules, and it gets really convoluted. We can go over it. When the employee is traveling away from their home community, so let's say it's a special one-day assignment to peer. Let's say they're traveling on the weekend. A lot of the times where this comes up, and again, this is federal, but where it comes up is I have a staff person that needs to be in, we live in Pierre, has a staff person that needs to be in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Monday for training. Well, I mean, you guys can drive to Sioux Falls pretty easily, but getting in and out of Pierre and travel and even getting in Myrtle Beach from Sioux Falls, you're going to have to leave, and let's say they don't have to be there till 6 o'clock Monday evening. You're probably going to have to leave Sunday. So you're traveling on a non-work day. Is that compensable time? if the travel is during their normal work schedule, that's compensable. But let's say the flight doesn't get in until 6 o'clock. The FLSA says that if they're merely a passenger of a train, an airplane, a ship, a bus, or a vehicle, or a boat, then that's not compensable if it's outside their normal work schedule. But if they're the driver of the vehicle, so you have 2 staff driving to Sioux Falls, let's say to catch a plane, the driver would get it would be compensable for that driver to get that extra hour, while the passenger would not. However, what a lot of employers do is they consider that all compensable time, because here's the other catch-22, because we're a smartphone, mobile device society now, is that if that employee goes and checks their email when they're driving, or they're a passenger, or they answer an email, or they answer their phone, that's considered compensable time, and they're actually working. And so it's hard as an employer, even though you might have policies on that, to ensure that employees are following it. Because even if they violate your policy, yeah, you might have right to give them if you have a point system, a negative point, or a reprimand or anything like that. But FLSA is still going to require you to pay it. So a lot of employers, even if the person's a passenger in one of these vehicles, they'll consider that compensable time. But the FLSA will not enforce it. However, your risk is that employee coming back and saying, well, I opened up my email at 5:30. That's considered work. And so these I kind of put this all in one slide, so when you get the slide deck, these are the main these are the ones where we get 80% of our issues. And I would probably say that's in order of how they get called in. The working off the clock, even if you have the policy, and even if the policy is it could lead up to termination if we don't work overtime unless approved. It can lead up to termination if you do. Okay, you can terminate the employee, but if that employee doesn't even follow your own policy, and they file a wage complaint with the FLSA, and it's found that they worked an extra 20 minutes a day for 2 years, they can go back and get back wages for that. So it's very important to not only have a policy, but enforce your policy. And if you're aware of the employee doing it, make sure that you get them compensated. Do any of you guys do comp time? What's your business? Okay, I was going to say, that's another question we get a lot. The city, you can do it. So have you guys ever heard of comp time? Because it's a 40-hour work week and someone's worked 40 hours and Friday's coming up. You say, hey, one way you can do is flex your schedule, don't work Friday. But let's say they need to come in for 4 hours. And you say, well, instead of paying you overtime for this week, we'll give you 4 hours of comp time next week. Private businesses cannot do that. Cities can do it, municipalities, governmental institutions can do comp time. But we get that call once in a while from employers saying, hey, we're looking at instituting a comp policy. And we tell them that you should be very careful because you can't do that. And the other area where they run into it is they do a straight line comp time. So someone worked 44 hours one week and they're going to give them 4 hours the next week. No, you're supposed to give them 6 hours because they get comp time. If comp time is allowable by the FLSA, it's at time and a half, just like that those paid overtime hours would be. All right, youth labor laws. A lot in South Dakota you guys are hearing. Obviously, youth engagement rate we talked about. Another exciting thing that we're doing at DLR, we received a federal grant to expand apprenticeships throughout South Dakota. We have a website called starttodaysd.com. I ask you to go visit it. There's a lot of information for employers throughout the state. Jim's office and staff can help you as well in regards to that. But when we started expanding these apprenticeships, a lot of the businesses in the apprenticeships on the national level were really trying to focus at youth. Because what we're finding is, A, youth aren't getting the workforce, right, at a younger age. B, we're trying to flip the script a little bit about, you know, the mindset of you have to go to a 4-year college. And career path, and having kids understand and parents understand career pathways. It's not just about being a welder, or just going in and being a CNA at a nursing home and doing that. I'm not putting that down, but having people understand the great career path that you can have when you start out as a CNA. I mean, the career path is wonderful in the nursing field. I mean, wonderful careers. And it's having people look at it not as a job, but as a career. And so we have a lot of youth that are going into, you know, I'm one of them. I went to USD, didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to be a big boy at Ken's Fairway Foods the rest of my life like I was in high school, but I went and got an economics degree. And what the heck do you do with that? I mean, there's no job skill for, I mean, what am I going to do with an economics degree? Go to graduate school, right? I mean, that's kind of this. So we're trying to push apprenticeships, getting youth within a lot of the trades at an earlier age, helping develop that workforce for a lot of the businesses. An apprenticeship doesn't mean being an electrician or working in manufacturing. There's over 25,000 occupations that are considered apprenticeable type trades. But one of the things that we had was, well, we'd like to get these youth in an apprenticeship, but we can't get workers' compensation insurance on them. And so then the myth kind of started going around is that you can't hire anyone under the age of 18, or you can't do a youth in an apprenticeship. And of course, as rumors go, they get halfway around the world before you even first hear them. And so we had to get and try to start being more proactive and kind of educating individuals and businesses on what youth labor laws are for youth and what they can and cannot do. And it also kind of comes into play because our state statutes and the Fed statutes, there's a lot of conflict. And so I'm going to kind of go over which ones apply as well. And so generally, the general rule is you have to be 14 years of age to be employed. Individuals under 14 years can do certain things. They can babysit on an occasional basis. They can deliver newspapers. They can be employed as a lawnmower, but they can't use a gas-powered lawnmower or an electric-powered lawnmower. Yeah. And oddly enough, they can also work in a business that makes Christmas wreaths. It's specifically pointed in the Fed regulation. I don't know why, but it's in there. And then there's the last one, the Shirley Temple exemption, which is they can be actors, TV personalities, things of that nature. Now, that's the general rule. And this is for non-ag. So when it's agricultural, that's a whole different ball of wax. When it comes to agricultural, youth under the age of 14 can do quite a bit more things. I mean, how many of you guys detasseled corn when you guys were a kid? Man, great job. Well, that was fun, huh? Yeah, considering I have like extreme allergies, that was like the worst 2 weeks of my life. And then when the parents own the business, the youth can be employed in more than just the limited exemptions that are limited. Okay, so South Dakota, we don't require work permits. Some states do. We try to pride ourselves in being as less regulatory as possible. We do have one work permit that we do allow. It's kind of a very small exemption that's only used a couple times a year maybe. And that's where if that youth is the main support for their family. So if like mom or dad can't support them and the youth is actually supporting the family, or if that youth themselves is supporting their own family, because that happens once in a while. The other thing that we do not do, nor do the feds do, once a child is 16 years of age, they can work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, doesn't matter. There's no limitations. But that's when they're 16. So when a youth is 14 or 15, there's certain occupations they can do, and I'll go over them. But these are the limitations on the state law. They can't work more than 4 hours on a school day. That includes Fridays. So Saturday, obviously, there's no school, and someone gets out of school at 4 o'clock, and they work the grocery shift from 4 to 10. By state law, they can't. They're limited to 4 hours when there's schools in session. School's canceled. It's Native American Day. It's a Christmas break. That's not a school day, so they can work more than 4 hours when school's not in session. Obviously, summer break. They can work no more than 20 hours in any school week. So again, that is when school's in session. If it's over Christmas break, they can work more than 20 hours. They can work no more than 8 hours in any non-school day. They can do no more than 40 hours during a week when school is not in session. So youth that are under the age of 16, because remember, there's no limitations on anyone that's 16 or older. When they're 14 or 15, they can't get overtime, which we wouldn't enforce anyway. Now I have those two asterisks. That's state law. So everyone has to follow state law. 4 hours, 20 hours. Federal law. No more than 3 hours on a school day, including Fridays again. No more than 18 hours during a week when school is in session, and then 8 and 40, which is the same. So if you're one of those small employers where the FLSA does not apply to you, your youth that are 14 and 15 can work 4 hours on any school day and up to 20 hours a week when school's in session. However, if the FLSA applies to you, the more restrictive applies, and so you have to go to 3 and 18. So we know how many hours they can work. When can they work? So federal law is 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., or during the summer months, 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., and only outside school hours. So I don't know if Madison, but I grew up in a small town, Miller, where we had open campus when we were like in 5th grade, small town. So I have 7th period free. I'm 15 years old. Can I go work at Ken's Fairway Food during my 7th period, even though I'm done with school for the day? No, because school's in session. And so when school's out of session, 14 and 15-year-olds can only work outside of school hours. Again, 16 and 17, none of this applies. State law actually has, the difference between state and federal is state law during the summer, they can work up to 10 p.m. So again, if the FLSA doesn't apply to you, your youth can work up to 10 p.m. And again, remember, this is non-agricultural. So if it's agricultural employment, there's a lot less restrictive hours worked. And also if the business is owned by the parents, none of this applies to them because there's not these limitations. The only limitations we have when it's owned by the parents is that what we call in state statute, when it's a health or moral hazard to the youth when they're under the age of 16. And what we consider a health or moral hazard are the hazardous occupations as defined by the U.S. Department of Labor. And those are working in a mine, dismantling a ship, working with explosives. Quite honestly, like pretty logical sense, I guess, because as I get into work comp, a high majority of work comp injuries, and it's unfortunate because some of the other hazardous occupations include working on a roof, working in a trench, working with woodworking equipment, working with power-driven tools, is in the building trades. But that's usually where the highest amount of injuries occur. And so in South Dakota, if South Dakota law is the only one that applies to you and FLSA doesn't, you can have youth that are 16 or older do it. Those occupations, when I get later slides, if FLSA applies, you can't. So what can 14 or 15-year-olds do? Pretty much the jobs that you see in your local communities. I do focus on hand being highlighted. They can't use power washers, which most car washing businesses have or someone set up. These are other things that they can do. Work in an intellectual, artistically creative nature, computer programmer, musician, developer, things of that nature. They can cook with electric or gas grills. It does not entail an open flame. For the most part, a lot of these regulations were written 50, 60 years ago. I mean, I haven't been in DeLon's DQ, but most fast food places now, it's not an open, I mean, they have these, whether it's a conveyor belt type cooking apparatus, things of that nature. And so they can do that. They just can't cook over an open flame. The other thing that they can do, deep fat fryers, they can't work at a deep fat fryer if it's a manual drop and lift. But I mean, I haven't been to, most places now have the automatic, you hit the button and they go in and out. 14 or 15-year-olds can do that without limitation. This is one that we get once in a while. Mom and dad call up and say, well, my daughter or son want to work for the Wessington City Pool, but they're not hiring her. And, well, how old's your son or daughter? 14. Well, it's because they can't. 14 to 15, 15-year-olds can be lifeguards, 14-year-olds cannot. And then they have to be certified and whatnot. These are the things that, kind of a list of the occupations, and I look at them as more of, even though they're occupations, I'd really look at it as activities within the occupation, because there's a lot of roles, a lot of things that youth can do within these occupations. And so when you just see the word warehousing and storage, don't be like, well, they can't work in a warehouse. No, they can. There's certain things they can do. Obviously, I have the asterisk for clerical work or office work, but they just can't be driving the forklift in the warehouse is really what they're getting at on that. 14 to 50-year-olds can't work in a freezer and meat cooler. However, I worked at a grocery store when I was 15, and I went in the dairy cooler like twice a day or more to do stocking. They can go in and out of a dairy cooler or a cooler. They just can't work like, let's say, in a slaughterhouse or something of that nature, or an area that's considered, their job is mainly in the meat cooler or the freezer. They can't do window washing when they're working from a windowsill. And in fact, 16 and 17-year-olds can't do that either if the ladder is more than 7 feet high, or the scaffolding. They can't do any work requiring the use of ladders or scaffolding. And I always add this one because it's kind of why they have this specific thing out there, but they can't work as a poultry catcher gathering poultry for slaughter or market. Who knew? All right, so that's 14 to 15-year-olds. 16 and 17-year-olds. Again, South Dakota law doesn't have anything restricting what 16 or 17-year-olds can do. This is all FLSA. And so if you're a small business and you don't have enterprise coverage or individual coverage, you don't have to worry about this. The state law just says up to the age of 16. Federal law has it for 16 and 17-year-olds. So we go through that. It's a pretty long list. A lot of people are like, well, what the heck can 16 and 17-year-olds can do anything except these types of activities. It's a lot of the buildings and trades, and a lot of an area where we need workforce development. But when you drill down, and I will not bore you, through all of these these occupations, there's numerous amount of exemptions. There's numerous amount of clarity on what a power-driven saw is. There's multiple levels of activities that can be done by youth in 16 or 17-year-olds in those occupations. And then we have the beauty of having the student learner agreement or an apprenticeship. If that youth is in what's considered a registered apprenticeship program, which is what we're trying to begin in South Dakota, and in fact next month is National Registered Apprenticeship Month. I do ask you to go to our website to get more information. There's going to be activities throughout the state. And at that time, we're going to be announcing We were awarded as a state about $847,000 from the feds, a grant to help expand apprenticeships in South Dakota. And so for about 6 months, we marketed that throughout the state, and we are providing $30,000 grants to businesses that apply to help offset the cost of starting an apprenticeship. The application process is closed, but we received numerous amounts of requests and applications for those grants to try to expand it. And when you have a 16 or 17-year-old in one of these registered apprenticeship programs, there are certain activities that go away that they can't do that they can now do. And so it opens the door up even more on what 16 and 17-year-olds can do. All right, so we had fun on wage and hour and some employment laws, UI. How am I doing for time, by the way? 11? Oh, there we go. All right, perfect. Unemployment insurance, a federal program, started in the 30s, and it used to be administered by the feds. Now each state administers it. However, it's a two-tier system. As employers, you pay what's called a FUTA tax, which is the Federal Unemployment Tax Act. And the federal requires each employer to pay 6% of the first $7,000 of salary for each employee that you have. So if you have 2 employees and they each make 20 grand, you pay $420 for each employee. However, if the state unemployment insurance program in your state is compliant with the feds, because as we know, the feds don't give anything for free, right? If you're compliant with us, we'll give you a credit. Each business, and you're compliant as a business with the state program, you get a 5.4% credit. So we're compliant as a state, and for the most part, all of our employers are compliant. And so each employer in the state pays 0.6% of that first $7,000. So you pay $42 for each of your employees to the federal tax program. That money goes to DC, it goes into a big pool with every single other state. And the feds have a really wonderful formula that is like the secret sauce. No one can figure it out. I think it's a dartboard. That they then allocate each state a portion of what was sent up to DC. It's unlike highway funding. You know, in South Dakota, we get like $2.30 back for every dollar that our employers contribute, or the taxes we contribute. South Dakota, we actually only get for unemployment from what you guys pay to the feds, we get about 65 cents back. And that money is for the administration of the program. Then you pay a state unemployment tax, right? And in South Dakota, we're a reserve ratio state. And so what that means is each employer has their own tax account. And 99% of the employers, and maybe you guys are reimbursing, but most employers they have a tax, they're a contributor. And so how that works is you have a reserve ratio. The state looks at your last 2 years of payroll, puts that in the denominator, and then looks at your tax account, how much you've contributed over the years, and if there's any claims, that comes out of it, and then takes that and you get a percentage. And then you take that percentage and there's a tax table or a tax scheduling code, and then it's like, Company A, your 2% reserve ratio, this is your tax rate. Company B, you're a 5% reserve ratio, this is your tax rate. And each employer pays their own specific tax rate based upon the reserve ratio. And in South Dakota, that is based upon the first $15,000. So you have 2 employees, same example, they both make $20,000 a year. You pay that tax rate based on the first $15,000. So if you're a 2%er and you have 2 employees at $15,000, you'd pay $600, $300 a piece. All of that money goes into what's called the trust fund. And the trust fund right now is $126 million. And that is only used for benefits. So when you have a claimant, so you have an employee that you have a separation, and they're deemed eligible for benefits, I can go through that process. Their benefits come out of your specific reserve ratio. We have a lot of employers that have a negative balance, and then there's a social cost that's prorated to all employers. The trust fund balance is healthy right now. Back during the Great Recession of 09, 010, we actually went negative, which we were one of 50 states, plus Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, that went negative. Everyone went negative. It did trigger a bad thing for employers because we have what's called a surtax, that when the trust fund gets to a certain level, every employer has to pay a surtax to try to buffer the trust fund. It's a pretty harsh tax because when does it kick in? It kicks in during a recession. What happens when there's a recession? Business is slow. Businesses don't have the extra money. And so we have to do a fine balance of making sure the trust fund isn't so healthy that businesses are paying taxes for something that's never claimed, but also make sure that we never want that surcharge to kick in again. So our Unemployment Insurance Advisory Council, 2 years ago, we reviewed trust fund balances, went over some formulas. We actually proposed legislation to provide taxpayers a tax break off the schedule if the trust fund balance reaches certain levels. Last year was the first year it could go into effect, and we got a tax break for all employers in South Dakota. That's like the one time when it's like, hey, I'm from the government, we're trying to help you. And I'd be happy to announce that that tax break is going to stay into effect this year as well. Our trust fund balance was above those levels. A lot of questions we get on unemployment insurance. There's two determinations that are made when an employee files for benefits. One is called the monetary determination, and that is to determine who their base page employer was for the year to determine what their benefit amount could be, because there's certain amounts and certain metrics they have to make to be eligible monetarily for benefits. And then the other determination is called the non-monetary, and that's basically the separation, like what happened. And so there's two types of separations, and within that there's a couple subtypes. The first one we're going to go over is the voluntary quit. So I walk in the door, Jim, hey, I love working here. I'm quitting, here's my 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks later, I go and file for UI benefits. If I voluntarily quit, or and I'm leaving because I got a better job, I don't get benefits. I'm not entitled to benefits. I made the choice. I voluntarily quit. Sorry about that. However, there are some limited circumstances where someone can voluntarily quit and still get benefits. The first one is the health hazard. So I'm working in a warehouse. My back is shot, and it's not work-related, so I'm not on workers' compensation, which, by the way, you cannot get both workers' compensation and unemployment insurance at the same time. And I go to the doctor, and the doctor's like, you gotta quit that job. It's going to put you in a wheelchair. And if that's the case, and that employee comes back to you and says, I got to quit because the doctor told me I got to go in the wheelchair, and they file for benefits, they're not going to get benefits. What the employee has to do, they have to have a signed certificate from their doctor prior to voluntarily quitting that specifically goes through a lot of enumeration. So you as an employer know this isn't just me making that determination. And they have to say that it's a hazard to their health and life. And it's a pretty high standard. A doctor or a chiropractor, a PA, a CNP is not going to just sign it off because your pinky hurts when you do something. It's got to be an actual to your life, a hazard to your life. The other instances are pretty straightforward. My wife gets transferred from Ellsworth to Williston, and I have to move with her, so I voluntarily quit. She's a military spouse. You can be eligible for benefits The domestic abuser, we see that one quite a bit. They have to move from their hometown or whatever town they're in because they're in a domestic abuse situation. They can be eligible for benefits if they voluntarily quit. We get this a lot in our UI appeals. We do about 750 UI appeals every year. The employer comes in and says, well, I said you're quit or you're fired. That's a discharge. That's a termination, not a quit by the employee. So this is where it's the employer making the determination. So all the employer has to show is that there's work-connected misconduct as defined by law, and then the employee is not eligible for benefits. So you have an attendance policy, and the policy is after 3 no-call, no-shows, you get a point, and after 2 or 3 tardiness or leaving early without getting the approval, you get a point. After accumulating 3 points, it can lead up to discipline, including termination. If you have a policy like that and you have it document, and it's always about documentation, as you guys probably all know, document, follow your procedures. If that employee files for benefits, they're going to be found not eligible for benefits because you terminated that employee for willful misconduct. And these are the other areas. Sometimes we get it where, well, they just weren't good at their job and they had a high error rate. Well, and so we let them go. Well, just because someone's not good at their job and you had to terminate them isn't willful misconduct. However, if you had the employee go through training and you did maybe some work improvement plans and the errors that they were making were just really stupid errors, we could consider that carelessness or negligence to a degree that was not in the employer's best interest. And we get that quite a bit. But again, if you're going to discharge someone for some of these things, make sure you have your policy, make sure the employee has seen the policy, make sure you document, and so forth. And if that's the case, more likely than not, it's going to be found to be misconduct by the employee, and they're not going to be eligible for unemployment insurance benefits. The next system we have, workers' compensation. Are any of you familiar with workers' comp? No. Whether by being a claimant or by administering it within your employer. Workers' comp, it's a pretty interesting system. I knew nothing about it, even when I was in law school. But it's a private insurance system in South Dakota. And what that means is you go out and talk to your insurance agent as a business owner to get work comp. Some states, it's actually a monopoly where I think the state of North Dakota is like that. It's a state-funded system. But in South Dakota, you go out and it's a private system, get your private insurance. It pays for 2 types of benefits. It pays for the medical benefits for the employee that was injured on the job and arising out of the course of their employment. And also pays for what's called indemnity, which is disability benefits. And those disability benefits kick in usually if the employee misses 7 straight days of work or more. And then they can get what's called temp total if they're not at work at all. Temp partial, which is a difference between what they were earning before and their benefit and what they're earning now. And then when it's all said and done and they've reached a maximum improvement level, we're an impairment rating state. It's kind of like laws of piracy, and a lot of states do this. Each body part has a value. So like your pinky's worth 15 weeks. Your thumb's worth, I think, 60 weeks. An eye's worth 150. Whole body's 310. But what we do is, so I got injured, I slipped and fell, hurt my pinky. And the doctor said, well, you lost 30% of your pinky for the rest of your life. And so what we'd take 30% times the value of the pinky, which is 15 weeks in South Dakota, to get what's that, 3 weeks, 4.5 weeks? We take the 4.5 weeks, take it times your comp rate, and your comp rate is traditionally 66 2/3 of the average weekly wage for that claimant. So if I was making $600 a week, 2/3 of that would be $400. So I'd take 4.5 times a week times 400, and I get paid $1,700 or whatever that is, $1,800, and then there you go. Medicals, though, continue. Medical costs, as long as for the rest of my life, and there hasn't been a settlement, I go in and the injury or the procedure or whatever my condition is of my pinky, as long as a doctor will say the major contributing cause of that was that work-related injury, that work comp carrier will cover that for the rest of time. And so work comp, there's a lot of tail, they call it. You know, an injury happens, I mean, we're still doing injuries from 1975. What happens, though, is as people age, they just, you know, if it was like a bad hip, or someone had a bad hip, they claim, well, it's from my work-related injury from 1975 when I slipped and fell. Well, the doctors come in and look at it and says, well, no, that might be a contributing cause, but it's a degenerative condition based on other things. It's not a major contributing cause. When that kicks in, work comp insurance is out of it, and then health insurance kicks in. Because if work comp doesn't cover it, health insurance will cover it. What happens, though, is you get that employee terminated. Did you guys have, what was that nursing home facility that took everyone for the cleaners? Did Madison have one of those? Well, they sold to Golden Living. Skyline, yes, Skyline Holdings. So we've had this situation, it's with Skyline Holdings. Skyline was a nursing home company. They bought like 16 or 20 units across the state, and it was a complete sham. They're out of New Jersey. They operate, their headquarters were above a pizza shop. That was abandoned pizza shop in New Jersey. There's no phones went anywhere. Well, they started, some of their workers started contacting us saying that Skyline was paying for my work comp injury, but now all of a sudden they stopped reimbursing, so my healthcare provider won't schedule an appointment for me, and my health insurance won't cover it because they say it's a work comp injury. And so then, unfortunately, the insured is caught in between. And what was happening is Skyline was basically didn't have work comp insurance. And what people are going to be surprised to hear next come out of my mouth is South Dakota doesn't require it. As an employer in South Dakota, you do not have to have it. However, it would maybe be one of the stupidest things a business did in not having it. Because work comp, whether you like it or not, it's the grand bargain that was made back in the 30s. And that grand bargain, what was happening is businesses were having people get injured and then getting sued in tort and being exposed to hundreds of thousands back then, but it could be today millions of dollars by attorneys, which I'm one, but attorneys can dream up all types of damages, pain and suffering, emotional distress, things of that nature. And so businesses and the insurance company and the unions back in the day came up with the grand bargain and says, okay, if you have work comp insurance, the only remedy for that injured worker is through the work comp program, and that's for their medical and then the disability payments that they receive. And when we do this disability payments, it's going to be limited, it's going to be clean cut, it's not going to be $1 million for a broken pinky, it's going to be 15 weeks, and it's going to be based on its impairment rating, things of that nature. And so the businesses and the unions and the insurance companies said, okay, let's start this. It's a clear, transparent, we're not going to go in front of a judge and a jury to say, oh, employer, you owe Tom Hart $2.5 million because he broke his pinky. Because that would shut Tom Hart down, right? And so work comp insurance, if you have it, you cannot be sued in tort by the employee for negligence. Now, if you don't have it, you no longer have the protections of work comp, you are now exposed to civil action in tort. Now, of course, you do have the remedies of defense remedies on negligence or contributory negligence. However, trust me, the cost of work comp is much less than what you could be exposed to in tort.
There's something about if you don't have the coverage, you can be responsible, they can double.
Yep, so and that's a good point. So Jim's question was, isn't there a statute that also requires you as an employer to pay double damages? That's true. So if you don't have work comp, you can be sued in tort, or you can be sued under the work comp statutes, but you will be responsible for double damages, and then you have no benefit of the medical fee schedule. So in work comp, we have our own medical fee schedule. Like we tell the physicians, the dentists, the optometrists, the chiropractors, the surgeons, the radiologists, what have you. We tell them this is what you're getting paid. You know, they can't, I mean, as we have all gotten health care bills, oh, it's $2,000, but, oh, we have an agreement with your health care provider, so it's $500 discount and so forth. We have the same thing in work comp. But when you're the employer and you don't have that work comp insurance, the hospital, you have to pay whatever the hospital or the clinic or the provider charges. You're liable for that. And so, good point, Jim. You have that risk as well. For a claim to be effective, it has to be arising out of, which means it has to be work connected. So, kind of the basic example I give, I work at a gun range, and there's a shooting across the street, and a bullet hit me and injured me. Is that arising out of? Is that connected to my work at the gun range? Could be, but maybe not. But however, let's say I worked at the gun range, and one of the people at the gun range who I was helping misfired and shot me. That's clearly work-connected misconduct. That's arising out of what I was supposed to be doing at the job. The second notion, and that makes it restrictive. I mean, that's the first hurdle that claimants have to show. It has to be arising out of their work. The next one is the in course of. And what does that mean? And it has to be, by the way, every statute for work comp has to be read liberally for the benefit of the claimant, because that's a statute as well. It says, what's the in course of on the clock? So when I leave the work site and go get lunch at McDonald's, and then I get injured, is that on the clock? What if I was picking up lunch from my boss at the same time? Is that on the clock? What if I was running some equipment back to the shop on my lunch break? Is that on the clock? What if I punched out for the day and I was walking to my car and I slipped and fell in the parking lot? Is that on the clock? And so that really broadens what in the course of means. We've had Supreme Court decisions, not by us, but Supreme Court decisions. This was the fact pattern. Here's a job site, construction site. 3 guys, the construction company has a policy of no horsing around. Okay. It's a construction site, right? What's going to happen? No horsing around. So there's a trench, about a 4-foot wide trench on the site. The guys were on their break time. It was lunch, but they stayed on site, their own choice. And one of the dudes said, how much would you pay me if I jumped over this? I could long jump this trench. Of course, no, you can't. Yes, you can. Okay, $20. Supervisor hears this, says, guys, that's against policy. Do not do this. I do not condone this. Do not do it. Guy says whatever and does it. And of course, what happens? He comes up short and severely injures himself. And so so he brought a claim. The insurance company's like, that's not in the course of, or he's not on the clock. and it was against policy, and they shouldn't have been doing it. I don't disagree. The Supreme Court, though, came down with a decision and said, based on some past circumstances, even though they were told not to do it, the supervisor would do that and then be a part of when they did certain things like horsing around. And so they consider that in the course of employment. So that insurance carrier was liable for this gentleman's medical and disability. And I think this gentleman was a perm, I don't say he was perm totaled, but he was a perm partial, which is significant money. And then the last part is what I kind of touched on earlier. The claimed injury has to be a major contributing cause. Employers, you take your employees as you find them. So if I come in with a bad back already, and then I'm working, and I have an injury, and it's from lifting a box, and I hurt my back more, if that doctor says the major contributing cause was from Tom lifting that box, even though I had a bad back before, that injury is going to be compensable, and insurance will be liable for it. These are the other areas where benefits can be denied under work comp. Intoxication, illegal drug use, pretty straightforward. A lot of you employers are probably like, oh, how do we do post-accident testing? A couple of years ago, OSHA came out with that guidance. That said, you should be careful on doing post-accident testing unless you have a reasonable suspicion that the employee was either intoxicated or using illegal drugs. But as long as you have a reasonable suspicion, you can do it. You just can't do a mandatory or a willy-nilly. A failure to use required safety devices. I'm a forklift operator, and there's a strap that's required. I didn't do it. Something happened. I hurt my back. That could lead to being benefits not granted because of misconduct. However, I'll get to the last one. That throws a wrench in that a little bit. Breaking the law, wearing seatbelts, speeding, the leftover volume, that's not yours. Post-injury gross negligence, believe it or not, we've had that. In fact, I've even had a worse one than that. We had a guy that was claimed he was perm totaled, couldn't lift his arms past here, was granted benefits. Doctors agreed with him, said, he's never going to get better. Was granted benefits. The insurance company caught wind that he was now head of officiating for a youth football league in a town. They sent someone down over there, and of course on videotape, things of that nature. That can lead to denial of benefits. But then you have to show that it was approximate cause of the injury. So the wrecking ball kills even if you're sober. So I'm drunk on the job, in the spot where I should be, and a ceiling tile falls and hits me on the head. Even though I'm drunk, I could still get benefits because that was going to kill me even if I was sober. Or not kill me, but I was still going to injure me even if I was sober or not. So you have to show that the condition is the proximate cause of what led to that injury for denial of benefits. These are responsibilities. Employees have to notify the employer. I'm sure you guys all have policies in place. Within 3 business days of when the injury occurred or suspected the injury occurred. Take, for instance, I banged my knee. It's no big deal, whatever, I banged my knee. But then like a week later, my knee blows up and I hadn't done anything else. That's could be when the 3 days. Once you notice you have an injury of that nature. Not just when you need minor first aid. And again, employer need only have actual knowledge that's liberally read. Even if that employee told his supervisor, hey, I just hurt myself and when I lifted up that box, that's considered knowledge by the employer within that 3-day period. Employer's responsibilities, you have to keep an incident report. You need to file a first report of injury or notify your insurance company to then have them file a first report of injury within 7 calendar days. Keep the incident report and injury report for 4 years. The insurance company, after the FROI, is what we call it, the first report of injury, is filed. They have then 20 days to make a denial or to begin payments on the claim unless they ask for an extension. They can ask for an extension up to 30 days. And that's where you think when United Airlines cancels a flight out of Minneapolis, phone calls go crazy. We get a lot of upset claimants because A, they're injured. No one wants to be injured. B, they've probably never done the work comp claim before, so the laws can be confusing. I don't want to say they're living paycheck to paycheck, but they need the money because their other bills aren't stopping. And at most, they're going to get 2/3 of what they made before. And the insurance company hasn't made a decision for 20 to 30 days. We get yelled at a lot. And it's not because they're mad at us, they're just mad at someone. And so we always have to remind them, our insurance companies in South Dakota do a good job. Our employers do in South Dakota do a great job. The base rates in South Dakota, it was announced in July of this year, went down 12.8%. That's a 7 out of the last 8 years that base rates have gone down. That doesn't mean you individually as employers, your rates went down. The base rate overall went down, and that has a 15-point swing. And so some industries, because it's based on industry, I don't know, do you guys know how you're rated for work comp? There's a NAIC code. So like power linemen, their base rate's going to be higher than clerical staff, just because of the nature of the position. And so each occupation has a base rate code, and then you as an employer have what's called an EMOD, an experience modification. It's based upon your past history of claims that have been filed against you as an employer. And so our base rates have gone down, costs have gone down, medical loss severity has gone down, which is all, really it's showing that employers in South Dakota are trying to provide a safe work environment for their employees. They're educating their employees. They're taking proactive steps. I know a lot of employers that have, morning stretching sessions or yoga or alternative types of meditation, things of that nature to make the workplace environment healthier. Because a healthier employee, studies have shown, lead to less lost time, less absenteeism, more productive, less injuries, which of course lead to savings because you have productivity in your workplace. I don't know if any of you guys have ever used SDSU engineering extension for OSHA consultation. If you guys ever, have you guys ever had an OSHA audit or review? No one? You guys have? So OSHA, again, is a federal program. We don't do anything with it. It's Sheila Stanley out of Sioux Falls, and I think they do a very nice job. They're very educational more than enforcement driven. But SDSU, the engineering extension up in Brookings, does, and we fund them. They get a federal grant. They do provide on-site OSHA consultation to businesses to help them do a review to ensure that they're compliant with OSHA, give them ideas of how to make a safer work environment. I believe it's free, but if it's not, it's a very minimal amount. It's the numbers that they provide and how they've reduced workplace safety and the employers that they've gone into, even if it does cost a little bit of money, the savings, you'll make up for it in spades and savings. One of the things that we get a lot, we have to do the base wage calculations for workers' comp. A lot of employees say, well, I was making $700 a week. Well, via statute, your average weekly wage is what you earned in the last 52 weeks, but overtime is at straight time. Bonuses sometimes are included, sometimes they're not, depending on how the bonuses are structured. Holiday vacation pay, if it's paid at time and a half or 2 times, some businesses do that, it goes straight to straight time. And so employees call us up and say, well, I was making $500 a week, so my comp rate should be 2/3 of that, which is $333. And we're like, well, no, unfortunately, for our computations, your average weekly wage was $401, and so you're only getting 2/3 of that. That's not a very joyful phone call because they're already upset because they're getting 2/3 and now they're getting 2/3 of less than what they thought. The last group that we have, human rights. So we have a human rights investigator. We have a human rights commission that oversees human rights in South Dakota. So we have the Human Rights Relations Act. That was passed in the 70s. And then we work as an intake office for the EEOC. It's out of their Chicago district office. And we do intakes for when the protected class is as above: sex, race, color, creed, religion, national origins, ancestry, or disability. And within those, there's subsets of that. What we get a lot, I think in Madison in the debate the other day, they talked about whether law should be brought on that. Gender identity, gender identity and transgender. Is that a protected class? Yes and no. Under Obama, the Department of Justice and the EEOC said yes, it's a set of sex. Trump, the DOJ under Sessions, said no, it's not. But then the EEOC says no, yes, still it is. And then we have courts that some have said yes and some have said no. And so the only thing that when we get those, when it's based on gender identity and things of that nature, whether we considered it under sex for our reviews. The federal EEOC only applies to employers of 15 or more. So if you have less than 15 employees, the EEOC doesn't apply. The South Dakota Human Rights applies. And then we don't do age in South Dakota. So you can be 40 years of age or older, and you can feel that you're discriminated against. We can't investigate any of those because we don't have a statute on age. That would be a Fed, but for Feds to do it, there has to be 20 employees in the business. We don't have a minimum on the number of employees. As long as there's one employee, we can take the complaint. We get about 120 a year. And we do have a backlog right now. The average age is about 6 months. We have one human rights investigator. And what we do is we do what's called a probable cause determination. The claimant has to show a prima facie case that discrimination occurred, and that discrimination can be either through disparate treatment or disparate impact. Disparate treatment is like an adverse action or constructive discharge. It's intentional. It's the employer did something intentionally. They treated someone in a protected class or discriminated against someone in a protected class. And you can see the two examples. Disparate impact is where people get kind of confused. This is when the employer didn't even know that they were discriminating against. And an example of that is, let's say you're an employer and you require everyone to take you don't hire anyone that's had a DUI on their record, even though your job isn't dealing with driving or anything of that nature. You just don't hire anyone with DUI. And it comes to find out that when you have that restriction, it severely impacts a minority class. That would be disparate treatment. You didn't do this intentionally, but your actions, your policies, led to discrimination on a protected class. So one of the things that we always, the education we get, and then we try to spread out is, you make sure you have an objective reason why you're doing certain things. And again, it goes to documentation. Make sure you have an objective reason. Like if you were a trucking company, of course, making sure people didn't have a DUI on the record, there's objective reason why you do that type of screening. But if it has nothing to do with the job duties or responsibilities, it's usually safer to say you shouldn't probably do it because you might be having a disparate impact on a protected class you don't even know about. And then next thing you know, you have an EEOC charged against you. And then the last part is retaliation. For instance, I was being harassed by Jim. I went and reported it to Jim's supervisor, and then Jim's supervisor fired me or disciplined me. That'd be retaliation from doing a protected activity. I was reporting what I should do. And what the courts look at is what's called temporal proximity, which is, temporal proximity is it's kind of a fallacy, but basically the easiest way to explain it is A happened, B happened, and they were close in time. C happened. Well, C happened because A and B happened together. And if you have that close in time, that temporal proximity, it makes it harder for you to show that, no, A and B just happened to happen. A and B aren't tied together. And so the courts look at that. And the big thing is, it's not required that actual discrimination occurs. I mean, if you just retaliate because someone claimed that discrimination occurred. So the best protections against such claims is just having good job standards and consistency. Make decisions based upon the employees on objective performance measures. What does it take to do the job? We get questions on hiring process of what you can and cannot do. And retention processes, have an objective standard, and always update. If you have certain standards that you haven't updated for years, and even I think the big case was Ford, and you continue to use them, and it ends up they have a disparate impact or a treatment on a certain protected class, even though it was your standard, if you hadn't updated and continue to update to ensure it's objective, you can get yourself in trouble. Interview do's and don'ts. We have a pamphlet on our website that can be provided for what you can and cannot do or ask during a pre-employment inquiry. A lot of this is just stick to the job. Don't worry about where they came from, what their background is per se in that nature, but just what needs to be done and can this person do it. One of the things that we get a lot of requests from, and we really can't do, is we're not the application police. And that means a couple things. A, we're not just going to show up and find a violation because you had a bad question or something bad on your app or during the interview. But we also can't, a lot of employers want to submit their applications to us to review to ensure that they're compliant. We can't do that. Because one of the things, and I didn't start it in my opening, but I usually start out, even though I'm an attorney and I work for the state, none of this is legal advice. I'm just giving you like the statutes. So, because, saying, well, Tom Hart said this, in the court of law or anything, it has absolutely zero weight. So if you do have any further questions or whatnot, we can point you in the direction and help guide you. But, we can't be your attorney or provide legal support or guidance for that. But, a bad question in your application or during an interview, it can be the smoking gun if an employee claims hiring discrimination. What does just the job mean? Just know the essential duties that need to be done. Review them frequently, make sure they're current. Hiring decision, like I said, based on an outdated element can look like pretext, which is you did it, you discriminate against, but you're trying to hide it. And then just asking them, how do their skills match up to what you're looking for? And this kind of goes on. The same thing. These are examples of what we tell employers to do. Have your policy. Because you also want to make sure you have workplace, a non-hostile work environment. So your supervisors and your managers and your employees, understand what the discrimination laws are. Do training. Make sure you follow your policy. We do this a lot in DLR. We do a lot of pre-onboarding questionnaires. We do a 30-day, we do a 90-day questionnaire, and we do an exit questionnaire. And we get a lot of really good input on things that we can always improve to do better. We always follow the the Dept policy, document unbiased measures of performance, honest and unambiguous communication. It's kind of like the keep it simple, KISS method and the hiccup test. These are some tips that you should have, or I mean not should have, but just some ideas you can have. Take complaints seriously. Make sure you investigate. Don't treat anyone differently just because they file a complaint. Now, these are other agencies that can help you. As I said, overtime, coverage, and any exemptions. I'm sure some of you are exempt, some of you are non-exempt employees, or you have both. If you have any questions on whether someone qualifies for exemption to be non-exempt or exempt from overtime, please contact the USDOL. That's a Sioux Falls office. They do have a Rapid City office if there's any of you have locations out in that area. They also handle Family Medical Leave Act questions. FMLA is a federal requirement. We do provide simple guidance on whether there's coverage on that, because you have to have, I think for FMLA it's 20 employees in one location or 50 within a 60-mile area, something of that nature. If you don't have that, FMLA doesn't apply. And there's a lot of changes going on in the FMLA world. The Trump administration talked about paternal leave, things of that nature. There hasn't been much movement on it. But in the overtime area, I don't know if some of you, I'm guessing quite a few of you, did you guys have concerns about when there was 2 years ago when they were proposing moving up the minimum weekly salary for exempt status for the salary? Yeah, so right now, there's 3 ways to be exempt from having to pay overtime to an employee. They can qualify as a professional exemption, administrative exemption, or executive exemption. And there's different little requirements to be placed in each 3. But the one requirement that's standard across the board is that they all have to make $453 a week minimum, no matter how many hours they work that week. And that hasn't been changed since like 1980. And so under the last years of Obama, U.S. Department of Labor, again, not us, U.S. Department of Labor proposed doubling that amount to $906 a week. And there was actually a lot of, it was bipartisan. I mean, there was support on that on the Republican side. Trump came in and said, no, we're not going to move forward with that. But there's been recent discussions again about, because everyone, even Trump administration, agrees it needs to be raised. I don't know if it's going to be somewhere in between that. But what was happening is we had it in Pierre. A lot of businesses might have a salaried employee that they pay $30,000 a year, and then that makes them exempt from overtime. Well, if they would have doubled that, that would have taken the minimum to $43,000. So a lot of people were scrambling, like, do we raise them up to 43 or do we change them back to hourly? And with on-call time and different things of that nature and duties, it was causing a lot of angst and concern amongst employers throughout the state. We don't handle that. Again, that's U.S. Department of Labor, because we don't deal with overtime. But those discussions are currently going on. And the reason why they're doing this, the main reason they're doing this is what was happening in the fast food industry is a lot of fast food places were hiring someone at $11 an hour, and then after 6 months to work the till, and after 6 months saying, hey, you're doing a great job, I want to make you assistant shift manager, and now you're salaried at $23,000 a year. So they got a little bit of a pay increase. But, by the way, the 3 people you supervise, if they call in sick or don't show up the day after the 4th of July or Christmas, you got to cover their shift. And so these people then were working 50 hours a week, but they're exempt. They don't have to pay the fast food. So what the administration still had the ability to go in and enforce that, because if just because you give them the assistant shift manager's duties, yes, that would make them exempt, and if the salary is at the $453 a week. However, if essentially they're not doing much different than they were doing before, they're not exempt. But it's hard for them to go in and do that. The easiest way they can tell if someone should be exempt or not is, what are they making? And so they wanted to move that up to force, the fast food industry, and it was happening in the grocery store sector as well, the retail. I digress. Workplace safety, OSHA. We don't do OSHA. We're not an OSHA compliant state. OSHA, that's all the feds. Sheila Stanley in Sioux Falls, wonderful. Under Trump, it's been more about education than enforcement. And I think that everyone's breathing a sigh of relief on that. And Sheila does a wonderful job. And again, SDSU OSHA extension, or engineering extension. And then our job service offices. Jim and his staff that you met this morning, they have a bevy of tools and products that they can provide you as a business. They can provide training or help to provide training for your current employees. They can help you seek new employees. They can work with you. And we have, again, an office in Madison and so forth. Labor market research, that was our LMIC. Our businesses are really liking playing with that. Instead of getting the calls, hey, I used to get this from my brother-in-law all the time. He's got a small business. Be like, hey, do you know kind of what the average wage for a CNA is in Aberdeen? Because I'm thinking about, hiring some people from there. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I guess make a call. Well, now he can go straight to LMIC website, pull up Aberdeen or Brown County or whatnot, drill in the ONET or the NAIC code for that specific occupation, drill it down by years of experience, because we get all that data from UI, and show that, well, they're making $12.63 an hour. I don't know. To help businesses get a baseline of, well, why am I losing employees? Well, they're leaving for an extra quarter. Well, then you look into it and it's like, no, we're actually like a quarter above everyone. So why am I losing employees? It could be something different than just wage. Again, any questions, contact us. I have my email address. Todd Peters is our wage and hour investigator. Ray Falk is our discrimination investigator. Quite honestly, and no offense, I hope I never hear from you, because that means you don't have a work comp problem, you don't have a wage and hour problem, you don't have a human rights problem, an unemployment insurance issue. But please check us out. We do have a lot of information out there. I think sometimes maybe we're not the best at getting it out to the employers, but if you have questions, please call us or check us out on the web. Not a single question except yours, Jim. And yours is more of a comment, a good comment. All right.
I guess, are there any questions for Mr. Hart? Or not? Well, thank you for his time.
Well, I really appreciate you guys taking your effort today to listen to 2 hours on employment laws.
Is this something that's available?
I can send it to you, yeah.
Okay.
You can just take it and save it and shout it out.
Case of any contact.
I've only got about 80 of them out there floating around. I did one in Brookings a couple weeks ago, but they wanted more on workers' comp and the student learner and apprenticeships. And then retailers, I did one on UI. And so, yeah. And bring your A game. Bring your A game.